Hi, and welcome back to White Noise. Today is one of our 7 Days of Horror episodes, and we are going to be talking about directors that made their start in horror, and we're calling this Born into Blood, which is a lovely title from Sky.
Mm-hmm.
So
I
thank
thought
her
it
for
was
that.
you.
No, that was you.
Oh, well, okay. Thank you.
But yeah, anyway, so basically a lot of directors, whether you realize it or not, started out in horror because surprisingly it can be a bit of a cheaper way to get into film. You kind of just have to have a good concept and even some crappy effects, and you can make something really entertaining and make your mark.
Also, especially depending on what decade it was, you could really get away with it.
Most of the films we're talking about today in like the 70s and 80s, because well, a lot of the directors we're talking about, they're household names, and that takes a long time. So these are people that have spent decades getting to where they are now. So obviously they started ages ago. Some are really obvious. I'm sure everyone knows about the fact that, you know, Peter Jackson made a really crappy horror film, and then he went on to make some of the most critically acclaimed films of all time, Lord of the Rings.
I didn't know that,
Oh,
so
that's so
a history lesson has already
interesting.
started. I was
Okay.
thinking before we even start, I was quite excited for this episode because it's one of those episodes where I have my wine.
Mm-hmm.
Leanna has her notes and I'm ready to just bask in her knowledge because like we're both huge film enthusiasts, we're both quite big horror fans if you couldn't tell, especially this month. But Leanna is like, she is on it with her history and her lore and her facts, and I am just always so interested. Like pretty much everything I know about film and horror and just everything comes from Leanna. She is my gospel. So I'm probably not going to know a lot of this. So if you don't know, don't worry. It's fine. I also didn't know, but yeah.
Well, it's so interesting to me because I think like maybe that's just like my Lord of the Rings nerd has just assumed that
Yeah,
everyone knows that, because
maybe.
you know, as a Lord of the Rings nerd, you're not just obsessed with the films, you're obsessed with Tolkien and you're obsessed with Peter Jackson. And I also think that like when you're into filmmaking, you learn a lot about like where directors started, because it's like, you know, those origin stories, they're inspiring. So you know, you constantly read, oh, their first film was shit, or their first 5 films were shit. It took like that until their 10th film to make a good one. So it's always really interesting to like read about directors' starts, you know.
So what was his start? What was the
So
film?
it's called Bad Taste. He made it in the 80s, and it's just like this weird alien, like I wouldn't call it like body horror, but it kind of is. It's just super gory, low budget New Zealand film, and it's just brilliant. Like there's not even really a storyline. I just remember watching it because a mutual friend of ours, he got me to watch it when we were teenagers. I just remember being like, there's no way this is the guy that then went on to make the most amazing trilogy of all time. And I'm not talking about Star Wars, I'm talking about Lord of the Rings. But anyway.
Oh God, Leanna's going to start the debates today.
But I don't really have much more to say about like the Peter Jackson one than that. It's just really funny that he just did such a massive pivot, you know. There's no like looking at least for me, you don't watch Bad Taste and go, oh, I can see where he went with, you know, this thing he's interested in. Like there's slightly similar bits, because there's gonna be with, you know, any director's like beginnings. But if we mention Star Wars, probably a good one to talk about is the fact that George Lucas also made like a really crappy horror film, like sci-fi kind of film. Yeah, it's honestly like, and some of these I say today, like I've got my list next to me. Some of them I'm not entirely sure if they were just like the director or if they were just the writer, because I think when it comes to like low budget filmmaking, especially in like the 70s and 80s, people wore a lot of different hats. I don't think that it is as clear cut, you know. So there is some where it's like, yeah, they definitely, you know, they did direct it. With George Lucas's one, I'm not so sure. But these aren't even the ones that I'm like super like fascinated by. The ones I'm like, oh my god, mind blown by are like Sam Raimi. I mean,
that's the one. That's the one I know. Yeah, I'm sure I'm not the only one, but that's the one for me.
What's so cool about Sam Raimi? Like, there's a few on this list where that first film, that horror film, is iconic. But like, come on, like Evil Dead, in, you know, it's iconic in its own right, not just because it's Sam Raimi's first film. You know, it's like it's got this huge cult fan base. It's like a complete totem in the history of horror, and not just that. But I think it's a really big deal when it comes to like low budget filmmaking, because you know there's always been low budget films, but that's one of the like major ones where it's not just considered a low budget film, it's considered like a brilliant film.
I think that's why it's really interesting, like you said, to start with, even though I didn't know about it, start with like Peter Jackson or George Lucas, who made like you said, quite crappy, maybe debatably, I haven't seen them, so I don't know, but like low budget, oh my god, low budget,
Wine.
the wine, yeah, low budget horror films that like probably people haven't really seen.
Yes.
Whereas Sam Raimi is one of those household names who got their start in horror and is still known for it to this day, despite the fact that they've, you know, had, I can't think of a better phrase, and I don't really like this phrase, but their fingers in quite a few pies.
Yes.
You know what I mean?
No, I agree. And it's like, it's really cool as well, because Sam Raimi's a good example of like the opposite of what I said about Peter Jackson. Like you can feel the stuff from Evil Dead in the rest of his films. Like lots of people said like Multiverse of Madness. I've not watched it. I'm just not a Doctor Strange girl.
Right.
I'm just
so
not.
I have, and
Yes,
I knew I was going to bring it up. This is where I can put my voice to it.
Yeah.
It is a shit film. It is, and it's like, again, we're not getting into the Marvel debate. One day we will, and we have kind of in the past, but we're not getting into it today. But Doctor Strange Multiverse of Madness is a shit film. I feel for like Marvel fans or just film fans in general, it's not great. But when I knew it was directed by Sam Raimi, obviously I was quite excited for it, because not only
people's attention, you know,
well,
that's a big name.
The thing with him is not only has obviously he directed one of the most iconic horror franchises of all time, he also obviously did the original Spider-Man films. So he had like his delve into the Marvel universe anyway. So if anything, it made so much sense for him to do this kind of film.
I agree.
And I don't care if it was his fault. I'm not blaming him for how bad the film was, but you could 100% tell without a doubt whose mark was on it. Like there were scenes in it that made no fucking sense that they were in this film. They were great, but they made no sense that they were in the film. And I think it's just such a shame that obviously it had to tie in with like this installment or this phase of the MCU, because I think it could have been really great. I wish they'd done like maybe like a standalone, like again, Leanna might not know or care about this, but like kind of obviously the What If series, the animated What If series, if maybe they could have done something more like that wasn't really related, so it didn't have to fit into the MCU timeline. And I feel like it could have just been a lot better. But that, I do think, whether you love or hate the films, is a great example of showing how somebody's influence and like where they got started and obviously what their forte is really shows through, even in films that like, because you've got a film and franchise like The Evil Dead, which is great, iconic, timeless, and then something more recent like Doctor Strange that was bad, but it still had some pretty gnarly sequences in it that were just great.
It's so funny, isn't it? Because it's like it's just such a tried and true thing to mix genres. Like it works like a charm. So it makes so much sense to bring people that do things like horror or comedy or something into superhero films, you know. It just it's obvious. There's an obvious choice. And I think like Marvel clocked that really early on. Like, you know, they've got that reputation now for like taking up and coming directors under their wing. We say under their wing, they're not taking they constantly will go for like, say, indie directors that have done like one or two films that did really well, and then they direct a Marvel film. But what's so sad to me is quite often no one gives a shit about who directed a Marvel film. And it's quite sad, really, that it's like just this one stop in their career, which is like a huge deal, but really doesn't technically really have their name attached to it all that much. It's just another Marvel film. And what was so interesting about Sam Raimi doing Multiverse of Madness was his name sold it to a lot of people. Because like we're saying, like we were like, fuck, because Sam Raimi did it. Like I nearly went and saw it, and I don't really give that much of a shit about Marvel films just because Sam Raimi directed it, you know. So it's really interesting that for once they kind of went the other way with things. But what is so interesting to me as well is it's not just indie directors they go for. They have a track record of going for indie horror directors. And it's not just Marvel, but like DC as well. David F. Sandberg, he did Lights Out, which obviously was like quite a big deal, I'd say. It came out in 2016. He had done this like short film on YouTube and it blew up. It went massive. And then he got the opportunity to be like flown out to the US, and like overnight, he turned his short film into a feature and he became massive. And then he did Shazam. So it's like there is a record.
I didn't know he did Shazam.
Yeah.
This is honestly this whole episode.
Once you start reading into it, it's really interesting how many of them do this, because I mean it's not a recent thing. Like we're saying, Sam Raimi did the original Spider-Man films. And you can tell, especially in Spider-Man 2 with the Doc Ock sequence.
Yeah.
You know a horror director directed that, because it is fucking terrifying. I don't
Mhm.
know if you've watched that back recently. It was on Twitter recently because obviously Sam Raimi's name was
Yeah.
circulating. Fuck me.
I mean, as much as like I might seem like I'm shitting on Marvel films whenever we talk about it, like I was raised on Marvel films, like I do have a connection with them. Marvel films of today, not so much. It was more like that 10-year period where there's that big build up, and like then the ones before it, such
Yeah.
as like the Sam Raimi Spider-Man
Yeah.
films. I love them, whether it's because of the directors and they were just better. I don't know, maybe I'm becoming the thing I hate and I'm becoming a purist. It's just like, yeah, it was so much better back then, but
Phase
either
one.
way. But no, you're totally right. Like, it's just funny you said, because I honestly, the original Spider-Man trilogy, I watch all the fucking Spider-Man is my favorite.
They're so
This is a,
comforting, and I
this
think
is
that's the
it.
Sam Raimi element. Like, even like,
Mhm.
don't get me wrong, Evil Dead's a horror film, but like the first, no, maybe not the first one, but like Evil Dead 2 and Army of Darkness, like they're comforting because they're
Yeah.
funny. There's like a warmth to them, you know, and the original Spider-Man trilogy have the exact same thing.
Literally though, and it's like you said, you can tell. Like with it's funny because with the multi, I didn't expect this to kind of like be a slightly Marvel heavy episode in the
Oh,
beginning,
I
but here we are.
100% knew it was. I think that's really interesting because I
But
knew
it,
that so many superhero directors started in horror. That's
yeah,
really interesting.
I just feel like obviously with Sam Raimi, for me being the prime example, because he's the one that whenever I think of like, directors born into blood getting their
Mm,
start in horror, he is the one I think of the
mhm.
most. And it is just funny talking about how like I think the Multiverse of Madness film was more obvious than the Spider-Man films. And I'm just
Mm,
curious as to why they decided to go a bit more horror focused with those than maybe they did the Spider-Man ones. I wonder if it's
mm.
because it was like earlier in his career, he was like, oh, okay, I don't want to be known as just a horror guy. Like, I want
I
a bit more
think
versatility.
not just that though, but I think Marvel has this thing where they really try really hard to be like irreverent,
Mm,
and Sam Raimi kind of fits that really well. So I guess it just kind of where Marvel is at right now, they really welcomed that from him with open arms.
mm-hmm,
You know, so I guess it's just like not just even to do with genre, but just like his tone and sense of
mm-hmm.
comedy. So the next one is
Yeah.
another guy that went into superhero films, and that's Zack Snyder. Do you know what his first film was?
Nope.
Dawn of the Dead remake from 2004. Yeah.
Oh.
And when you go back, you can fucking tell because it's high contrast as fuck.
Do you know what? I feel like I've only seen the remake. I don't actually think I've ever seen the original Dawn of the Dead.
Interesting.
Mm.
Interesting.
I think subjectively I knew it was a remake. Like now, like I'm very aware that it was a
Mm.
remake, but I think when I watched it at the time, I didn't know.
Well, I mean, it came out when we were quite young. Like I watched that before I ever
Yeah.
even knew there was an original. So exact same here.
Hmm.
But
But
anyway, yeah,
yeah.
he started out with that, and it's it does feel like him, but it also doesn't. Like all the
Mm.
cast look like they'd be in a Zack Snyder film. Does that make any sense? Like people in
Yeah,
his
no, I
films have a
get
look,
that.
you know, and then like everyone looks a bit like they're in a like model catalog.
Hmm.
Like they don't look like it's hard to explain. They don't look like A-listers, but they also don't look like everyday people. They're that weird
Hmm.
fringe where they just look like models, you
Yeah.
know? And it's so weird because it's like, yeah, there's that element and there's the high contrast, but everything else just doesn't feel very Zack Snydery at all. So
Hmm.
it's like he kind of like had the visual down, but he didn't. But then actually, do you know what? Even me halfway through saying that, I don't personally see much of a tone to Zack Snyder's films.
I actually agree because right, just as you were saying that, I'm sat here trying to like make the correlation, and I
Mm,
think like yeah, not like Sam Raimi in the sense that you could 100%. I mean, I get that it is just not just the two films, but it was the two films that everyone was making the comparison of like Multiverse of Madness and The Evil Dead. Like, the, if you didn't know it was the same director, you would have to say there was inspiration, if nothing
yeah.
else. But I agree. Yeah, with Zack Snyder, I can't. I I don't think I could like have like put one of his films on, and I'd be like, yeah, definitely.
But it'd be the look, wouldn't it? It wouldn't be like
Yeah.
the vibe or the themes. Like,
But then I
feel
think
free
with
to
the
correct
look,
us. We might be wrong,
yeah.
but I don't think
Okay.
there's any themes in his
I
work.
think with a look it's tricky though, because obviously look can definitely be a like a director preference,
Mm,
but it can also come down to the era that it came out. He's one of those ones that I feel like you have to know him and his films to be able to spot it.
mm,
Whereas I feel like with others, you could watch a couple of their films without even really thinking about it, and you'd be like, there's
Mm,
something familiar here. Whereas,
yeah.
yeah, with his, I feel like, yeah, you'd have to be like a proper diehard fan to
Yeah,
really be able to have a
people were like either
comparison.
super into him or not. I do fall in the latter camp.
Yeah, same.
Don't get me wrong, I love Sucker Punch. What a
Hmm.
film, brilliant film. But that's more because it like uses his style in a more interesting way. Does that make sense?
See, this is the thing, right, with something like Sucker Punch. Like, why wouldn't you make that your thing? Because that would have been amazing to see more
Yeah,
films made in that kind of style.
yeah.
And because I'm the same, I fucking love Sucker Punch. I remember when I used to go to the gym, I went on the like cross trainer one time and I stayed on it for the entire time. I had like a little like shitty
Yeah.
knockoff iPad and I watched the entirety of Sucker Punch on the cross trainer.
Amazing.
Um, and yeah,
It
it's
gives
just
you
it's
fucking hype, doesn't
no,
it?
but
Like,
that's what I
especially as a
mean.
woman. It's so funny to me because like I always think of Zack Snyder's films as very like male, and they're not because he did Sucker Punch, he did Wonder Woman. Do you know what I mean? Like Lena Headey is an
Mhm.
absolute icon in 300, and it's like I don't know why. I guess it's just his fan base is so like
I guess
male.
it's because as much as obviously they can be quite female led, they are very female led through a male gaze. So
That's
I
true.
get, because even Sucker Punch, I love it, but I feel like with Sucker Punch, it's one of those films that women have taken
Yeah, I
on
agree.
board. I don't think he ever
Oh
intended to
no,
make it for them.
no. And even if
It's
he
just
did, he did it in the wrong way, and he lucked out in that women claimed it for themselves.
exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. It was never made for
Mhm.
women. Women just took it. It was kind of like a fuck you. This is ours now.
Yeah, no, I agree.
Yeah.
So, like the outfits and stuff, like we do not even need to
The
start
outfits,
going
the
into that.
storyline,
Yeah.
like, oh my god. I mean, we're definitely not getting into it because we already did talk about female rage at one point, but I was reading an article the other day about how like female rage as like a concept has kind of gone through the years
Hmm.
and how like films kind of sucker punch like so many male directors and creators kind of encapsulate female rage as women who have been wronged and
Yeah.
mostly wronged by men and more often than not wronged by men in a sexual manner. And it's kind of like obviously whilst there are films like that that can be quite empowering for women, again more often than not they tend to have really exploitative scenes
Yeah.
or narratives that women don't want to see. Like, we get it from what you're inferring. We don't need to see it and have it like thrown in our face. And I think Sucker Punch is kind of one of those that kind of tips the
Teeters the line
balance.
for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. There's
Hmm.
some bits in it where like you don't see something, but it's so heavily implied. It's like you might as well just fucking put it on the
Hmm.
screen at that point. I'm not saying do it, but I'm just
Hmm.
saying you really you did kind of overstep a line, you know? And
Yeah.
it's like Sucker Punch is funny because it's like while it's like, yeah, we've reclaimed it, it is also very icky.
Oh,
And
hugely.
it's so interesting because it's like I go back and I watch other Zack Snyder films, you know, like Justice League, Wonder Woman, and all, and people treat them like these feminist things. I'm like,
But you know, Wonder Woman is another one that I remember on it. Oh my God. I remember going to the cinema to watch it and being like, what the fuck?
mm,
It was such a prime example of people just thinking because a woman is a lead in it, and
mm,
also she is played by an actress who is quite outspoken about the feminist themes and concepts in it. But then you can't show me a film where it ends with her gaining her power not from thinking about the women that raised her and the aunt that pretty much made her who she was,
mm.
but thinking about the man she'd known for 2 seconds. Like, honestly, tell me you're a man directing women
I
without
know.
telling me you're a man
It's
directing
just so
women.
like 1950s Disney. Do you know,
Oh
it's
my
so
god, yeah.
outdated. And honestly, sorry to all the Zack Snyder fanboys, but he just feels a bit outdated to me.
Yeah.
Does that make sense? Like his style as well. Like it just feels very like 2008 to me.
Hmm.
Like I don't really see its place in 2022, 2023. Like and it's not really evolved much. It's just like it's the same slow-mos, it's the same shutter speed, it's the same high contrast. And it's
Hmm.
like it's so funny to go back and watch Dawn of the Dead because like that style fits there. And it's like, mate, it's been nearly 20 years.
He
Like,
never moved on from that. Yeah.
Let's change it up, babe. And I don't understand. Like, other directors, they changed it up so well. Like, ones that started in horror. So if we're going to move to the next one, and this is someone I think treats women quite well, John Carpenter, starting out with Halloween. Let's go. Let's go. Honestly.
Yeah.
Created Final Girls, pretty much. There is an argument to be had that Black Christmas did it. Yeah, it's kind of true. But if we're talking in like generic terms that everyone knows, everyone thinks of Laurie Strode. I can't.
It's also like interesting for me because I think I might have mentioned once before, Halloween, like the original Halloween films, I don't really like them. I think it's just because they are a product of their era. I'm not saying that they're bad. Like it's kind of one of those things where like, yeah, I don't think they're bad films, but they're a bit too slow for me. They're a bit too. I think it's strange because, and I don't know why, but I guess I kind of compare them to Scream in the sense that like they have this kind of very realistic villain who like in real life would terrify me. Like the amount of times I've seen people on like TikTok or Instagram or whatever recreate like, oh, would you survive if Michael Myers was chasing you? Because like all he does is walk, but it is terrifying.
Yeah.
And in a similar way to obviously Ghostface and Scream, like he fucking trips over a lot and, you know, like it's clumsy and it's messy, but yet they still get their kill. And I don't know, I don't know why. I think maybe I watched them when I was a bit too young. Like I actually remember seeing the first Halloween film. It was when me and my family went on a trip to America, and it was just I don't know, I think it was just randomly playing on TV one night, and I watched it, and I must have been about 13, and maybe that was too old to kind of actually I think it might have been too young to really maybe appreciate like slow build kind of horror. But it just wasn't for me. But I still do appreciate how iconic it is. I mean, it's definitely one of, in my opinion, beating a dead horse kind of situations, but it's still going to this day. As we speak, the last film is being released, you know, but horror is probably one of the worst genres for that, or best. It depends what franchise you're talking about, because I've said many times how the Nightmare on Elm Street series, no matter how bad they are, it's one of my favorite horror series. I just love how ridiculous and stupid they get. I guess with Halloween it's a bit different because the villain was never comical, so I don't think they could really get away with having that kind of level of stupidity. But yeah, definitely you had that iconicness.
Well, it's just so funny because it's like John Carpenter actually did make like a film before it, but it's not really considered like his first film. Halloween is. And so like to come out of the gate with something like Halloween is insane, because it's, the way I would always describe it is it's very like restrained. It's very like, meticulous, and like he knew exactly what he wanted with everything from it. You know, like he was like, I want Jamie Lee Curtis. Like they were like, we need her. Like her mum was in Psycho. Like we need her in this film. And even things like it's a wide lens, and that's why when you're constantly stalking around in the neighborhood, like it's so eerie because you can see so far around you. That's why you constantly feel like when you're watching that film, you're like looking at this doorway and you're looking around the corner. And I pointed it out when we watched Scream recently, that Scream borrows from that a lot. Like that's where you feel like you're looking at like doorways and around the corridors and stuff when you're watching it. It was the first feature film to properly utilize Steadicams, so they spent like a massive part of their budget on that, but it's because he wanted that creepy like gliding feeling to it, and that's what gives like Michael Myers some of his like almost like supernatural vibes. So it's like, while he is, like you say, very rooted in reality, he is just a man, you also do get that like kind of feeling like maybe he is more than just a man. Do you know what I mean? He's like a weird in between. He's not a Freddy Krueger and he's not a Ghostface. He's like somewhere in the middle. And that's what I always really liked about Halloween, is it's like there's no actual evidence that he's like supernatural or anything. But like it's things like when he like disappears really quickly, or he suddenly appears and stuff like that. It's like, oh, I love that. It's so good. Honestly. And then he goes on to do other films which are funny as fuck. Like then he spent like the 80s doing films like They Live. Have you ever seen it? It is fucking fantastic. I don't know if you've ever seen images from it. It's the one where the guy puts on glasses and he sees everything for what it really is. So like there's an alien race that are like taking over the planet, and you can only see them with his glasses on, and they've been brainwashing humans. So like posters for products like when he puts the glasses on, they say things like consume and obey, and like bankers and stuff are all like aliens. Oh, it's so good. So it's like a big critique of like, you know, like capitalism. Then he does stuff like Big Trouble in Little China and Escape from New York, and like just all these like silly, cheesy, fun romps. And it's like, this is the dude that made Halloween. Like I just think he's iconic.
I think a lot of directors just kind of have this power anyway, because at the end of the day, it's just part of being in a creative profession. But like, I think I really like the idea of like directors have got their start in horror and then moving on to maybe comedies or rom-coms or whatever. Because sometimes when like I'm writing and I get like a new idea for something and it's like totally different, a completely different genre to what I'm doing right now, and I'm thinking, fuck, I can't do that. But then I'm like, but why?
Yeah.
Like, you know, if like Sam Raimi can do The Evil Dead and then do Spider-Man, why can't I do a stupid little supernatural romance and then do a Stephen King-esque mini horror?
Interesting is the amount of like comedians and horror filmmakers who have said that they are the two sides of the same coin. It's all about timing, it's all about execution and payoff.
So true though. Yeah.
Jordan Peele has said that loads. He started out as a comedian and now he's a modern master of horror.
I mean, stick around for the rest of our Halloween episodes this year, but this is something we have touched on in another episode, is how horror and comedy share surprisingly so many of the same elements, and it's why they do marry so close together. So good.
Well, two directors I really want to talk about. They've kind of, one has stuck to horror, which is Jordan Peele, and the other one is bloody Edgar Wright.
Oh,
yes, he did Spaced and shit, but if we're talking films, his first film's a horror. A lot of people forget that Shaun of the Dead it's a horror film, you know? Like, yes, it's like I wouldn't even call it parody. It's not. It's like a love letter, isn't it? To like George A. Romero. And it's not a it's hard. I don't really know where I would pin it.
The thing with Shaun of the Dead being like so iconic in what it is because I would agree with you, even though obviously it is a parody. It doesn't feel like one, because obviously then later down the line, being part of the Cornetto trilogy, it gets parodied in itself. And it's so
its
funny
own thing, isn't it? It's not just parodying an existing property. It's like it takes moments and lifts from things, but it's still very much its own film.
Well, it's really interesting because I saw Hot Fuzz before I saw Shaun of the Dead.
Really?
And there's one scene that always sticks in my head, and it's so funny to me because obviously the way I saw it makes sense, but then it baffles me how it was made. So the scene in Hot Fuzz when Simon Pegg and Nick Frost are like going to hop over the fences, and he's like, what, never taken a shortcut before? And then he like hops over it and it's like amazing. But then in Shaun of the Dead, he says it and he fucks it up. Now, to me, in like a parody that fit a normal timeline, you would have the Hot Fuzz first and then Shaun of the Dead, and that's how I watched it.
So for Edgar Wright so genius.
But that's what I mean, for somebody to almost parody a scene that they haven't even invented yet was crazy.
I see it a different way. I see it as the joke in the original. It's just a little joke that he goes to jump and then he falls, because, you know, you're expecting him to have that iconic moment. And then the joke of the second one is you're expecting him to fall again to repeat the joke from the first film.
Totally. No, I get it, but this is why
it the opposite way to other
this is what I mean. This is why it's so interesting to me, because obviously I watched it the wrong way. So for me, it played out the way it would in a parody. Like if, for example, if you watched a film and then you watched like one of the scary movies,
how clever he is, doesn't it? That you watched it backwards and it was the traditional way. And I honestly, like, Shaun of the Dead, man, like, people seem to forget how creepy that film gets in moments. I'm sorry, but the bit when he's in the car and his stepdad is turning, that's horrific. And then when they're in the pub and he goes out back and he turns the light off and you can see all the zombies outside. When they get into the pub, and there are moments in that film where, like, the first time I watched it, I shat myself. It's like, it's a comedy, but it's like, it does well.
And there's also those heartbreaking moments that come with horror, like obviously when his mum gets turned and then his best friend gets turned. but you have the playoff of like he keeps his best friend as almost like a pet, and it's just
there's no one who can balance tone like Edgar Wright.
yeah, it's so fucking good.
Everyone goes on about Jordan Peele now because Nope had a lot of comedy in it, and like
Yeah.
Get Out had quite a bit of comedy in it. Us is like somewhere in the middle, really. But like,
Yeah.
Christ alive, like I
think
still to this day think Shaun of the Dead does it best.
I think the thing with like Edgar Wright and Shaun of the Dead is that well, I couldn't say at the time because I was quite young, but the way I look back on it and think is that I don't think people appreciate it for what it is like when it came out. So I feel like people thought, oh, they're taking this classic thing and they're taking the piss out of it. But like this is when there is a big difference between taking the piss out of something and then, like you've said before, writing kind of like a love letter to it. You have people who really like say, let's take for example the original Carrie film, and then obviously we had the remake of the Carrie film, and people were like, but exactly, because it claimed to be the re-envisioned version of it. But I feel like if you can take something, say, such as Dawn of the Dead, and then put Shaun of the Dead, and like kind of put that like comedic twist on it, but without insulting it. Like it never felt like an insult to the original film. It never felt like an insult to the genre. It just felt like an add-on. And then it also became its own thing in the Cornetto trilogy, which I think really paid off as well.
Because it takes inspiration from the genre without like taking inspiration from a specific film. Because it's called Shaun of the Dead, but it's not parodying Dawn of the Dead beat for beat. Like I feel like that's where they went really right with that film. I think if they tried to like remake Dawn of the Dead in like a London city, a shopping centre or something, like it would have been so bad.
Although, have you seen Cockneys versus Zombies?
I don't think I want to.
I'm not saying it's like a Dawn of the Dead like parody or anything, but like it's just one of those things that I saw. Like I think my dad put it on one night, and it is literally like just zombies in like London. Yeah, it kind of just proves your point, is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, I also think like I love me some British horror because you don't get much of it. And especially like British horror comedy, because that blends all my favorite things. British comedy is so specific. Mix that with some horror. Come on, baby. Like Attack the Block was so popular.
Yeah, do you know what? When I was even talking about the Cockney versus Zombies things, I almost said it's kind of like Attack the Block, but I didn't, because it's not. I just think I agree with you. I just think like British horror comedy is so good because as a nation, we never take things seriously. Like without getting a bit too deep, let's just take the past 3 years as an example. But sometimes it's beneficial because we get these kind of films. Like we're just so good at taking absolutely horrific situations and being like, it is what it is.
Well, the ending of Shaun of the Dead, when he's chained up in the shed. You know?
Exactly.
In another film, it would just be so heartbreaking. He lost his best friend. He's living with the trauma. But in this, it's just a repeat of an earlier scene. They're playing a game together. Like, you couldn't get any more like Edgar Wright than that. You just. But on the flip side, if we're going to talk about, if we briefly mentioned Jordan Peele, so if we're going to talk about him, have you seen Nope yet?
I haven't.
Okay, so I won't talk about Nope then. Just doing the polite thing.
I'm sorry to everyone listening that wanted to hear us talk about it. It's because I don't have any friends that want to go see horrors with me.
So basically, Nope has its comedy bits, and it's in obviously a very Jordan Peele way, as it's gonna be. He's the bloody director. We all kind of think of the comedy in Get Out when we think of Jordan Peele. So the very classic joke about Obama. Like I think that's the one everyone thinks of. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And what I really like about like the comedy in Jordan Peele's films is like it's so different to his comedy. It's like, did you ever watch any of like Key and Peele?
Yeah.
It's really out there, isn't it? And then the comedy in his films is like really subdued, and it's just like in the dialogue. I'm like, oh, that's really interesting.
Do you know, I actually find this with a lot of comedians. I think it is like anything, but with comedy especially, it depends what your platform is. Because sketches, stand-up, and films are all very different platforms, which is also why sometimes some directors and actors and creators just don't translate well because they don't understand the different formats. But I think obviously Jordan Peele is a really good example of this is how you can, I feel like whether you like his comedy or not, you can tell that somebody is like just funny because they're able to translate it into whatever platform
like
that
any
they're
format or
on.
platform.
Like, yeah, like it might not be your brand of humor or your brand of horror, but the fact that they can translate it so successfully, like, yeah, Jordan Peele is a great example of, you've got people who are just fans of his horror films, and then you've got people who are just fans of his comedy.
I agree. And it's so, what's so cool to me is like that he's already considered such a genius. Like he's just been so quickly recognized for the fact that he can do all those things, comedy and horror, like, you know, two sides of the same coin. But like, just because you've mastered one and you doesn't mean you instantly master the other, you know. The ability to do one will help you in the other, but that doesn't mean you're automatically going to be great. You've got the tools, but I feel like what Jordan Peele's really good at is he takes the tools and he really like, he kind of uses that to make the horror even better, and then vice versa. And I feel like Sam Raimi does that same thing. Like his comedy makes the horror better, and then the horror makes the comedy better. So it's like those two are probably like the best examples of using them to complement. And it's just like icons. I feel like, and it's interesting because Sam Raimi started in horror and then went more comedy, and Jordan Peele started in comedy and went more horror.
I was just about to say, it's like, but this is just it though, that how it's kind of just like a bit inspirational for just creative people in general, that like you can like I feel like, so me and Liana, as an example, we both love horror, but we both love romance. And, you know, we both, like, when we talk about our own writing and stuff like that, we battle constantly between how do we marry the two, because we're still learning. So I think it's so interesting to see directors who got their start in one genre and then not only moved over to the next genre, but they took what they knew and they learned and they loved from that first genre and they carried it on. They didn't go, oh, I'm going to do this, because they could have done. Would the films have been as successful? Probably not. But I'm not saying they would have been bad, because they obviously understand the tropes and the timing and everything of both of them. But I think it's really important that they didn't just completely abandon, you know, their origins and where they started from.
I agree. And do you know who is actually like a really good fusion of all three, but didn't start in horror? If we're just going to quickly mention like a flip side of this whole conversation we've had today, friggin' Park Chan-wook, man.
So true.
Because if you think about, say, like First, you've still not watched it properly since your weird first experience with it, have you?
No, I haven't, but I remember enough.
Film is horror and comedy and romance, and it's like, fuck me, I don't know how he fits it all together, but it works. How does he fit all of that into one? It just works. I think it's just, that's him.
It's because he's a genius.
He's an icon. But like, when the new film comes, that's going to be like thriller romance.
Oh, I'm so fucking excited. I'm excited. Our viewers should be excited, because we are going to be on that shit the moment it comes out, or maybe a month afterwards, because, you know, we're usually quite behind on stuff, but we're going to be on it.
It's going to be very exciting. We're probably like quite deep into this episode now. When I talk about horror, I lose track of time. But one, we got to mention him, Sky. We got to do it. James Wan. Come on. Who comes out the gate that talented? So like, you and me are both very big advocates for the fact that the first Saw film is a brilliant film. Like, we both say this, don't we? And like, you know, everyone has their thoughts about the rest of the franchise, but that first film, you cannot deny, is by itself a really good fucking film. It's more of a procedural than anything, which is really cool. And I think what's really interesting to me is that James Wan, like, he basically did a horror, not necessarily because he wanted to be a horror director, but like, it's what fit his budget at the time. And it's what fit his writing skills at the time. I just think there's so much to learn from that. It's the same thing you saw with Sam Raimi, you know?
Yeah, I also think with him as well, like, we owe a lot to him, because he's possibly a big part of the reason why we're friends and why this podcast exists. Like, because obviously the Saw franchise is, I mean, realistically, my mind can't go back that far. It's like going back 10 plus years now. But like, I would, whenever I like think about our friendship at the beginning of our friendship, the only reason I watched the Saw films is because you lent them to me. You lent me every single one, and I went through every single one. Like, literally, though, and I loved them all. But yeah, I completely agree that I mean, I didn't know that the only reason that, like you said, he even did it is because it happened to be what he fell into.
Like, as in he didn't like horror and didn't want to make a horror film, but it's like the way he talks about starting in film, it's very clear that he like recognized, like, oh, on a lower budget, as long as you've got a good idea, horror can really work,
But
because
it's
you can't
true
do
though.
action on a high budget.
Yeah.
There's certain genres you've just got to accept you can't do. Horror is a really good one. Like, you look at Lights Out, Paranormal Activity, so many films which are like a very simple concept. Even like It Follows to an extent. There are certain films where it's like it's more about the idea, isn't it?
I was gonna say, I feel like it's because with horror you can get away with so much of, as long as you plant the idea in the audience's mind, you don't necessarily have to show it.
Exactly. And I think what's really interesting with Saw is when you go back, there's not actually that much of the traps in the first film.
Oh no.
And it's so interesting. It's like mostly just
Whenever
most of that film is conversations.
Whenever I think about the first film, I think of it as like a bottle episode in a TV show, which, as Leanna knows, is my favorite kind of like, I just love
too.
Is it situational? I don't know what it's actually called, but like I just love shit that it's in one room. I don't know if it's because I actually like it or I just really appreciate the kind of levels of creativity you have to push to be able to pull it off.
I agree.
And when I think of Saw, even though obviously you do have cutaways, I always think about it as if it's kind of like a bottle episode of something. I never really think about all the external shit. I think about that conversation,
like how
that happens.
The reveals are that happen just in conversation.
Like, honestly, I would have fucking loved that film probably even more if it had been like one of those like student budget kind of films that had no outtakes. And actually, it's funny to say that, because when I was in media in secondary school, I don't know what happened, but we were given a task of like creating our own short horrors, and it never actually happened. They changed the curriculum like halfway through, which fucking sucked. But when we were planning it, I was like the only person in my little group who liked to write. So I was like, okay, I'll write it. I'll just fucking write it. And I'm not saying it would have been great, but it was Saw that I took inspiration from. It was this whole idea of being in like a classroom and like these really kind of like these fucked up things happening, but only through people sharing their stories. Because I don't know, it's just to me, it's so much more interesting.
It's so funny you say that, because now so much is making sense to me. Like in our recent episode about the Vengeance trilogy, you said that your favorite part of Lady Vengeance is like that bit in the room with everyone. Like, it's all coming together.
I mean, it makes sense because we've said countless times, I think I've even said it on this episode, we're both writers. So I feel like good, as much as like obviously like visuals and character development, which is a part of writing, but like are obviously a big part of it, storytelling is essential. Like I feel like you can have the lowest budget in the entire world, but if you have a gripping, compelling, and just phenomenal story, you can get away with so much. And even though Saw had a bit more than that, that's all it needed. It just needed the chemistry between those characters, the story to keep you hooked, and then that fucking twist at the end. And that was it. That's all it needed.
Sold. Yeah.
It's like, it didn't, as much as I know it was like iconic of it didn't need the leg being sawn off. It didn't need any of the other traps. It didn't need the cop storyline. It was fine at its base. Everything else was kind of just like a little bit of seasoning.
That's so well about the original Saw film is like, without all the like stuff that the later films got focused on, it was already a good story and a good film, like you're saying. And that's where they fucked up. They didn't take the thing that actually made that first film so good as a film. They took the iconic imagery, but they didn't really take like the heart and soul of the film.
So true, because even the second one, which like I loved the second Saw film. Probably one of my favorite. Like I think the twist in it is one of the best, but it was on a bigger scale. And I do think, like you said, it took away from that like nitty gritty. Do you know what's really funny? Do you know what I'm comparing it to right now? I doubt anybody has ever made this comparison. I'm thinking about the original Twilight film. Like, the kind of, how like super fucking indie the first Twilight film was, and then obviously it blew up.
It's the same thing.
But you know what I mean? It got handed to like other big name.
Well, it's the exact same thing. It happens with so many franchises. Nightmare on Elm Street. That first film was actually super low budget. Like the producer had to like remortgage his house, and the whole cast and crew went 2 weeks without being paid because they couldn't get financing. So it's like the first like Nightmare on Elm Street film is low key a bit of an indie film, and then it got scaled up.
when you don't have the budget to do something, you're like risking so much. So you put everything into it, and that really comes across to your audience. Like, not always. I'm sure there are examples of ones that just definitely did flop. I'm saying the short. I know there are, but I feel like, you know, obviously when you like get a higher budget and stuff, and especially in like today's horror, you rely so much on having the budget to do like either really good visual effects or twisted visual effects that you think that's gonna sell it. And it's like, no, horror at its core has always been about storytelling. Before you even fucking had people making these kind of films, you had people round fucking campfires telling these stories. It was always about storytelling. And I think this is what so many directors who are getting their start now are forgetting.
Yes,
I agree. They're not realizing that, like, you know, people like Sam Raimi and Edgar Wright just, they didn't, it was, like I said, it was the story, it was building upon the characters. And like Jordan Peele is a good example of like horror of today that is recognizing, whether actively recognizing it or just so influenced by it that they're able to do it passively. But that's why it's working in like his films, because he realizes that, yeah, of course, it's great when you can have like really visceral and visual scenes that stick with you. But at the end of the day, it's about the storytelling. It just is.
And I mean, if we look at what I would say are now being considered the three modern masters of horror, that is Jordan Peele, Ari Aster, and Robert Eggers. All three of them started with horror, and they're all very people focused. Hereditary is like one of the most people focused horror films I think ever, really. And then The Witch is about the horror of like dynamics between a family, and they just completely get that it's about the people and the story first. But if I'm gonna go completely against everything you have been saying and pretty much everything we've been saying in this episode, I'm gonna talk about one final person, and I didn't put in the notes because I really want to like jump scare you with it, and that's David Lynch. Because you can debate if Eraserhead is a horror film or not, and I don't think you've seen it, have you? But I'm sure you're familiar with the imagery.
I've seen enough.
Yeah. So the thing with Eraserhead is it really is vibes. It's not really a storyline in that bad boy. There's just not. That's in a lot of David Lynch stuff, let's be real. There's not really a story, but it's so fantastic. And I would say that's because it goes so far the opposite way that it becomes like really cerebral and like bizarre. And
do you know what, I totally agree with you. Okay, so I will just revise what I said. Horror movies are about storylines and vibes without a doubt.
100%. And then but then also to back up like what you said, people getting carried away, he got big budget money to make Dune because it kind of has horror vibes like in its original novels, and it flopped. So it's just so interesting to see like what horror filmmakers, if you know, horror is a very vague term, but we're using horror, and we have been the whole episode. It's really interesting to see who starts out in horror and then can, like we said earlier, grow from it, and then who kind of just get carried away and it was just a means to an end to build a career. But I think like some of the people we've talked about in this episode, you know, we can categorize into these different camps, but the ones that have kind of remained icons learned from that first experience of making a horror film. Your Peter Jacksons, you know, your James Wans, your John Carpenters. And like this has honestly been one of my favorite episodes.
I've had a lot of fun.
Careers.
I had more to say than I thought. I was fully ready to just sit here and like let Leanna just educate me.
No, because you had loads to say.
I was even if I'm not as knowledgeable, I would say, as Leanna is, I do love horror. And I love it not just because like it's an aesthetic or anything like that. Like I just genuinely do think it has some of the best storytelling and character development, because you have to. Like when it comes to horror, if you don't relate to the characters and you don't buy into the story, you don't give a shit. Even like fucking shitty rom-coms, you can even get away with really poor character development because you just want those characters to get together. That's all you want. But with horror movies, they could die, they could not die.
Yeah, you need to care about the individual, don't you?
Exactly. So yeah, I've actually, this has been a very enjoyable episode.
You surprised yourself.
Yeah, I did.
So yeah, I really hope that everyone enjoyed this episode. Obviously, we've got a bunch more coming up in 7 Days of Horror. We've been very much enjoying October. We hope you have too. Like we always say, leave us recommendations if you can think of other directors that started out in horror or some great early into career horror films maybe. Let us know in the comments or let us know on Twitter or anywhere you like, because I'm always looking to expand my horror knowledge, especially the ones that need a bit more attention. And I'm sure Sky wants to hear about some more of them too.
Always. If you couldn't tell this episode, I'm always up for a discussion. Like, educate me, talk to me, as long as it's horror, I'm here.
She's happy, yeah. So yeah, if you enjoyed, leave a like and subscribe, and we'll see you in the next one.
Yeah, okay.
Bye.
Bye.